I wanted to have a discussion with you all about the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, because this story in particular is a little bit difficult to unpack, I think for a couple of reasons. One, it was published in 1892, so the style of writing is a bit antiquated. And then two, the narrator who is telling the story is suffering from a deteriorating mental condition as the story progresses, so she kind of gets more manic and harder to follow as the story goes along. So what I wanted to do, just like I would do if we were meeting face to face, I would have you read the story first and then come to class and we would go over the discussion questions together. So if you're able to have those pulled up while you're watching this and listening to me, I think it would be helpful. So I've got 12 discussion questions about the story, and some of you can probably answer them perfectly well without my intervention. But if you're having any doubts about the story, if you're unsure about your interpretation, I just want to talk about it with you as we go through each question. So I ask the first question about the overall message. And every reader kind of takes away something different. So you can't really get that question wrong if I ask you what message you're left with after reading the story. We have different lenses that we bring and different perspectives that we bring to literature. So as a feminist, every time I read this story, it's upsetting to me because I find it to be very negative in its treatment of the female character, partly because she is female and because of the time period. So the message I take away is kind of twofold. One, women should not be treated the way that this narrator is being treated, but also people with mental health issues should not be treated the way she's being treated. So it's kind of a cautionary tale in that way. But you may have a different take on it, and that's perfectly valid. Because it was written in the 1890s, that's the second question, it was read actually as though it were a ghost story, like a haunted house story. So readers at the time thought there was literally some kind of a ghost living in the wallpaper. And we as modern readers don't necessarily see it that way. Number three, the factors leading to her mental breakdown. I think that would be a really good essay topic because there are several factors to explore in this story. It's not just one thing, I don't think, contributing to what ends up happening to her. She is locked in a room with no mental stimulation. She's not allowed to write, which is a really good outlet for her. She's not allowed social interaction, which would be good for her too. She is condescended to. She's put in a room that she doesn't like. All of these things. And then I think one of the biggest factors, which is connected to number 4, the presence of the baby. The baby's not mentioned much, but I think you could really make a case for her suffering from postpartum depression. That was a condition that was not acknowledged in 1892 when this story came out, but it's something that the narrator was probably dealing with, and even worse at the time because it wasn't acknowledged as an actual mental health problem. So we now know if that condition goes untreated, it can lead to psychosis, which is what I, as a reader, take away from the story. I think that's what's happening. I think the case could be made for that. Like if you wanted to write about that, you could, although it's not provable. You know, we can't say for sure that's what's going on. That's just a guess that I have. The next question deals with the husband's treatment of the narrator. His name is John, and he's a doctor, and he is treating her as if she were his patient. She has another doctor too, but we now know that treating our own family members is not ethical, so that wouldn't hopefully be done anymore either. Some students see his treatment of her as like he's doing the best he can with the knowledge he has at the time. Other students see him as being condescending, as treating her like a child, as being overly controlling. So that interpretation is up to you. The key features of her room. It's a very odd room. It's not just the wallpaper that's troubling. It's the fact that the bed is nailed down to the floor. There are bars over the windows. There are rings on the walls. And she was told that this was used as a nursery or playroom before they occupied the house. But it looks to me, if I could see it, in my mind's eye, it looks to me like an asylum. So it's kind of like you put someone who's having mental health issues in an asylum, they're not going to get better, right? So it may have actually been used to lock crazy women up in the 19th century, which was done. There's a whole book, an anthology of literature in the 19th century. It's called The Mad Woman in the Attic, and it's about how many stories and novels at the time had this character that they would just lock up and lock away. She may have been having postpartum or menopause or some other hormonal issues. That was very taboo, and it wasn't talked about at the time, so they would just lock her in an attic. My phone is falling over. My really fancy setup here. And then so she starts to see in the wallpaper. Now we're on to number 9. What does she see in the wallpaper? It changes. It becomes her focal point, her focus of fascination, because it's all she has to look at. And she has a very vivid imagination as a writer. And so her imagination just, latches on to this wallpaper. So it changes over the course of the story. But what she eventually starts to see is a woman, or perhaps several women, that are trapped inside of it. And these images are like mirror images for what she's going through on the inside. So she kind of sees a reflection of her own psyche, her own state of confinement, by seeing what she thinks is a woman or women trapped in the paper. The very end of the story is a little confusing, okay? So read it a couple of times. What happens is she's decided, there's a woman that she needs to free in the wallpaper. And she locks the door so John can't get in, and she starts tearing the wallpaper off of the walls. And by the time he finally gets in, he probably is forced to recognize how serious her condition is, because I assume she's covered in wallpaper. She is crawling around the room, and so she talks about this smudge, along the wall. She's making that smudge because she keeps crawling around over and over again. So when he sees her, he faints, presumably because he's finally like, oh, okay, now I understand how bad this is, and it just freaks him out because he's been in such denial about it up until this point. So he faints, and she just keeps walking, or creeping actually, in circles around the room. And whenever she comes to his passed out body on the floor, she creeps over it. So that's why she says, I have to creep over him every time. And then she says, before she says that, she says, I've gotten out despite you and Jane. Okay, and that's confusing too. The character Jane has not been mentioned until this very last part of the story, and my interpretation is that the narrator herself is Jane. And her psyche has split so much she's traded places mentally with the woman she thinks lives in the wallpaper. So she has now become that woman in the wallpaper, talking about herself in third person. I know that's a lot. It's a lot to unpack. It's a lot to deal with. But just read the story again if you need to. Go through the questions again. Let me know if anything is still unclear. Or if you have other interpretations. Again, I'm not saying that my interpretation is the only right one. I'm open to what you have to say and think about the story too. Okay, hope you guys are having a great week, and I'll touch base with you guys soon.